The first Witcher game wasn't perfect. It had repetitive character models, some of which were based on the people from the studio itself, gestures that rivaled those from the Gothic franchise in terms of cringe, and suffered a lot of cuts to the features and content that was promised at first.
And then after another probably year, we again cut a piece of it. I'm not sure if it was half or 30%. And then again, the same. And still when we finished the game, it was 100 hours.
For example, sometime into the development, the budget forced the Reds to cut nearly half the characters and still maintain the draft of the story, due to which some of the pre-existing side characters had to be repurposed, like for example Thaler, who became a spy just because the former head of Temerian intelligence disappeared from the alpha version. Nevertheless, the game was a breakthrough for CD Projekt Red. It was their first and probably the most important game they made because a lot was at stake. It was also a game where a lot of talented Polish developers started out, later to go on to make games like, for example, the Dark Souls clone, Lords of the Fallen.
The reviews were almost unanimous at that time. Great story, great characters, and a blurry line between good and evil.
And while such an opinion is prevalent in the reviews we can compare at Metacritic, that's where most of the compliments end, as the game was far from perfect. It is visible from the get-go that the developers had a lot of technical issues. Let's start with the Aurora engine, for example. The first Witcher runs on the same engine that was last used in the Neverwinter Nights series, and it hasn't been used since in its initial form. After all, Witcher was a 3D game with a third-person perspective that was running on an engine designed for a game with an isometric view in mind. Many gamers that gave Geralt's debut a try were complaining about the long loading times and the poorly directed cutscenes, and while the latter was probably a result of the aforementioned engine, it is also worth pointing out that at that time, there wasn't a cinematic division per se working on the game. Sure, in their next games the Reds had a team working on cutscenes that look really well, but the first game, well, let the prologue speak for itself.
He's exhausted from teleportation. Magic light is about all he can muster.
Go. We'll deal with him and join you at the barrier.
But apart from that, the game didn't have any greater flaws, and while it was a middle market title and that was quite visible, the developers achieved what they hoped for, and that was telling a good story in a morally ambiguous setting of a dark fantasy world.
Let's get back to the camera, however. We can play from a typical third-person perspective, but the game also has an isometric view, which is even brought up before we start the game. The look you're seeing right now was later added on to make the game more immersive, and personally, I can tell you it does its job, as the time spent in Vizima is one I'll remember fondly. Many people praise Witcher 3 for going back to the roots, those Slavic themes we all loved, and it's hard to disagree, but the first Witcher still had a unique atmosphere that's only in that particular game. In Geralt's first virtual adventure, we are forced to stay longer in certain locations, and thus we had ample time to take them in, as the next areas were unlocked gradually as the story progressed. Exploring the poorer part of Vizima, we felt like someone was just about to try to mug us. The daily life there was terrible, the camera locked behind Geralt's back and made us almost smell the stench of piss and garbage taken straight from the pages of Sapkowski's novels. You can't turn your sight away, you can't mount a horse and take off to a nicer place. You're stuck in this decaying world, interact with those characters, and are an integral part of it. That also results from some of the game's faults, like an often need to backtrack, but despite that, the game is really immersive and the developers made the best of the bad design, which is a feat in itself. And just like the game world, the story had a much smaller scale. We're chasing a guy who stole the Witcher's mutagens, and that's mostly it. Sure, after time a bigger villain emerges who coincidentally wants to take over the world with an army of mutants, so we naturally take him down.
Through the most of the story, Geralt was on his own. Nobody really seemed that interested in the Salamander gang, and the White Wolf himself didn't get involved in any bigger intrigues.
The game tackled issues typical of the Witcher universe: xenophobia, religious zealotry, and poverty. During our adventures, we also encountered much smaller, interesting quests that were impossible for us to ignore. We got to spend some time with the working class, got to know the local readers, and were much more invested in the local affairs. Even though quests had what seemed like a typical good option most of the time, it always had some negative aspect to it. The first Witcher also had a tendency to drag on. The main story could be completed in around 40 hours, but a completionist needed almost twice that time. And I personally think that would have been a good idea to make some parts of the game shorter. Most of the game consisted of running back and forth, as the promised fast travel option never made it to the final product, which was really frustrating. Looking back at it now, it seems that the initial isometric point of view had even a bigger impact on the game. The title could be played with just one hand. After all, you have a lot of walking, a lot of dialogues, and combat that fit a typical PC control scheme.
And speaking of fighting, usually developers, when trying to implement something original or something that seemed cool on paper, realize that it doesn't quite work well in practice. But when it comes to fighting in Witcher 1, it was quite opposite. It sounded absurd in theory, and in reality, it was surprisingly fun.
In the game, we have to click to perform a single attack, and then again to do another. If we click yet again at the right moment, we can do a combo and inflict more damage. It sounds a bit like Diablo, but it's a more advanced Diablo in actuality, because you have to also use our special abilities and take into account how our enemies are positioned in the battle. The battles themselves were quite easy in that aspect. If we swung our sword right, we were bound to win eventually. I mean, most of the time. If the fight was too hard, we had to use the active pause to navigate the encounter and maybe take some potions before the battle, because in comparison to later Witchers, we couldn't drink mid-fight. The combat maybe wasn't something revolutionary, but it was fun, especially if you were keen on rhythm games. A large part of what made gameplay enjoyable was also the character progression. We didn't get any unwitchery abilities and some crazy non-canon skills, but we gained new animations and Geralt was dealing more damage with every level. It wasn't very elaborate, but it was balanced and executed well enough for that time, even though nowadays the simplicity of the combat might seem funny to some.
Despite greatly enjoying the game upon its release, it's really hard to recommend it nowadays because, let's be honest here, it hasn't aged that well. The first Witcher's best element, which was the story, after time made its way to the Wild Hunt, so it's not really necessary to go back to the game. Sure, the story in the first Witcher was good, but it wasn't revolutionary or groundbreaking by any means.
What stands out about the first Witcher from the rest of the trilogy is certainly the music. Sure, Assassins of Kings and The Wild Hunt both had great soundtracks, but the first one was more unique in its own way. It was less epic and more melancholic, natural, going hand in hand with the more depressing and down-to-earth version of the Witcher universe. The atmosphere that gained a lot from the score is probably what makes the first Witcher worth going back to, and if you still haven't played it, you certainly must. Thanks for watching, I'm Jordan, I'll see you soon.